Welcome to the Joypunk podcast. I'm your host, Jenelle Etzel. Today, I am joined by Seth Lorinczi. He is a Portland-based writer who focuses on psychedelics, intergenerational trauma, Holocaust history, and the Washington, D.C. punk scene of the 80s and 90s. He has been published in the San Francisco Chronicle, the Oregonian, Portland Monthly, Moment Magazine, and numerous literary journals. He has presented on psychedelics and ancestral healing at Yale University, the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, and was a part of helping to create Judaism and the Psychedelic Renaissance, a first-of-its-kind live event here in Portland, Oregon. He's played in numerous bands, including Antimony, Circus Lupus, the Corin Tucker Band, the Golden Bears, the Quails, and the Vile Cherubs. Welcome to the show, Seth.
Well, thank you so much.
Often when I tell people I started a podcast called the Joypunk podcast, they immediately think it's about music. And punk is obviously a genre of music, but it's also a philosophy. And I wonder if you can share with me what punk has come to mean to you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. It's an orientation. For me, it's a spiritual orientation, not at the risk of immediately going off the deep end. But yeah, sure, there's the genre of punk music, which I feel like at this point has kind of expanded to mean kind of anything you want, which I think is great. I mean, I love the idea of an ever-expanding universe of music, right? Mm-hmm. For me personally, I was trying to put this into words earlier. There's this sort of popular notion that punk is all about revolt and rejection. And I think that is true. Mm. I think every single person I know who came to the punk scene in DC, at least, came out of some kind of disorder, some kind of trauma, some kind of early life lesson that things don't work the way that we were told they do, right? Mm-hmm. That said, there's the revolt and rejection piece, but there's also, again, at least where I grew up in this very specific punk scene, and I think every city's punk scene is highly specific. It is really rooted to place and time.
It's true.
The idea was we can do something different and we can do something better and more connected than what is happening all around us. And of course, Washington, D.C. in the 1980s is a really stressed place. It's an intense place to grow up. So that's what it means to me. It's an orientation towards we're going to do this. We're going to make something, not we're going to burn it down.
Mm. I was taken right back to, I remember that election. I was in third grade in the 80s. And it was my first memory of, my parents and other parents maybe not being on the same page. And I remember smoothing my skirt and knowing that my mom was so excited about Mondale and Ferraro. Yeah. And hearing about Reagan and not knowing what it means now looking back and that was a really interesting time.
I'm so glad you said that. For me, a real touchstone is the election of 1980, which is the first Reagan election. And that's the first election I remember. And again, I'm in DC, like you rub up against politics and the various administrations in all sorts of ways. It's sort of it's woven into the fabric there. But that was the first sense I had of something outside. Oh boy, I was going to use the word malevolent. I think that might be a little strong, but maybe it's not. I have a very clear memory of looking over my father's shoulder as he watched the nightly news and seeing these seas of white, kind of corn-fed faces cheering on Ronald Reagan. And what he represented to me was an embrace of, well, for one thing, nuclear war. Right. And everyone I knew who grew up in DC in that era knew that, nuclear war was not an abstract. 9 years before, I was born in 1971, 9 years before that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a battery of anti-aircraft missiles stationed 3 blocks away from my house. It was hidden behind a hospital. There really was a kind of war footing. And everyone in DC knew that, should things go off, we're done. Like, we're Washington, D.C. We're the most visible target on the planet. And as a kid, and I will say as a probably highly anxious and sensitive kid, Again, this is not an abstract.
Yeah.
So I look at the TV and I see these faces cheering this man who says, let's go big. More missiles, more bombs, more force. And that was a real turning point for me. That was one of those moments in which I felt like, not everyone sees the world the way I do.
Yeah.
In fact, maybe most people, and again, that election was a landslide.
Yeah.
That was a real turning point for me. This idea that, again, the world doesn't work the way we were told it should. And a real separation. You know what I mean? I think like anyone who gravitated towards punk, they felt a separation from the people around them. And that was one of mine.
Yeah. It's so funny because you think of punk rock as a rejection in so many ways, but it was also one of the first places I felt really accepted.
Absolutely.
Just like let it rip.
Absolutely. That moment of finding the other freaks that's important.
Pretty great.
Yeah.
Finding punk rock, what were some of the bands and the people in that scene that were really influential for you at that time?
It's a good question. I kind of came at it sideways in that I'd always, since I was a young kid, I really gravitated towards the music of the 60s. Actually, like the sort of sharp, short songs like the early Who and Kink singles, which you could still hear on radio, easily at that time. Again, I think about that notion of being separated from the world around you, which I think a lot of people who gravitated towards punk and a lot of people who became creatives also felt, right? Like there's a separation from the larger culture. But for me, I was a musical kid and, again, a sensitive kid. And that was kind of my way of interfacing with the world. Like music was feeling, music was emotion. So I'm growing up in the 70s and all around me is sort of soft, I almost want to say soothing. I'm thinking of, you would hear Hotel California, you'd hear the Eagles, you'd hear Pink Floyd, you'd hear Led Zeppelin, you hear these sort of like epic, quote, meaningful tracks. And then you'd hear something like Can't Explain or Anyhow, Anywhere, Anyway, Anyplace. I still don't know what that one's called, but I'll never forget that notion of standing by the clock radio and like, what is happening in my body right now? So I came to punk through the 60s. And it took me a while to understand that a lot of the people around me, the people who were in bands like Fugazi and Rites of Spring and Soulside and Kingface and all these, other greater or lesser known bands, they were super into that too. Like 60s, what's today called 60s punk or garage, that was a huge touchstone for them too. I mean, Minor Threat covered the Standells, who also did Dirty Water. They did Good Guys Don't Wear White. They covered Stepping Stone, which the Monkees had performed. I mean, not exactly a punk band, but so I came to this kind of sideways. And then as I entered the DC scene and sort of became more ingrained in it, I found these group of people. And again, Fugazi is an obvious one. Lesser known bands like Ignition, who were really meaningful for me. My high school band played with them, and that was a real sort of introduction to this world of not only sort of obscure music, like weird English kind of anarcho-punk stuff, but this life too of these sort of big tattooed motorcycle riding art freaks, really. And these people who had just dedicated themselves fully to living a very different life from the people around them. And that was just catnip to me. I had to know more. And I just sort of fell down the hole with that scene and those people.
I can relate to coming in sideways. Maybe I even came in I don't even know if you call it sideways or upside down, in that I didn't like punk music. I remember I had my first date with my husband, who's a huge music fan. And he was very excited when he heard, like, I'm going to set you up with this gal. And she was in a punk band. He's like, oh, we're going to have so much to talk about. And the first thing out of my mouth, when we asked me about my band, is like, I don't really like punk music. It wasn't something that I initially liked. It's just all we could play because we had no technical skill. And so that is right where we were thrust. I had to think of like the Raincoats, another fantastic women's band. And it does remind me of that really rudimentary kind of 50s rock where you know 3 chords. And I grew up with a dad who told me, if you can play Louie Louie, you can play anything, you know? So that was it was strange way into punk. And then getting into the scene and realizing, oh, wow, these are my folks. It reminds me of going to Houston, Texas, too, where I was a speaker for the National Association of Realtors. And I just thought, Texas, those aren't my people. And you show up and you realize, wow, they're pretty punk rock.
They absolutely are.
You know, Texans, they're outsiders of America. And
Yep.
we are going to do it ourselves. And they have this attitude. So I've come to realize punk is, yes, it's a genre of music, but it's also this attitude.
It's, again, an attitude, an orientation, just a belief in something outside of what we're shown day in and day out.
I want to touch back on, you mentioned Fugazi, and you were working at, I think it was the famous punk club in DC, The Space.
DC Space.
Yeah, DC Space. And you write about seeing Fugazi for the first time. I just wanted to read this for our listeners. It's so beautiful. Held in the music's inescapable crush, my sense of myself as an outsider began to melt. In its place came another feeling, the notion that I might be accepted for not what I did, but merely because I was. All of us in this room, I'd wager, had learned far too young that the world didn't really work like it was supposed to. That what we'd been told was not actually true. What nights like this promised was that there might be no before and no after. That the past was wiped clean and the future didn't exist. There was nothing but the invitation, the demand to make something of the moment to show up. That's really beautiful.
Thank you.
I've been reading your writing, your newsletters, and you wrote about getting a telescope as an 11-year-old kid, and that it inspired you to explore the things that were hidden or beyond what you could see with your own 2 eyes, that it had you exploring the edges of life since. And I really love this idea, and it comes up for me in so many different ways. Just biologically speaking, the edges between 2 different ecosystems is where there's the greatest fertility or the most complex ecosystems. And then again, it comes up for me all the time in all the great stories and myths. There's usually like an old witch who lives beyond the edge that a brave hero will go seek for wisdom. And this old idea that the answers we are seeking won't come from the safety of the village. That we must be willing to head towards the dark woods and listen to the crazed rantings of the crone on the edge. What does being on the edges and exploring the edges mean to you right now?
I've been thinking a lot about the idea of, I'll back up. I have a 16-year-old daughter who is exploring the world and sort of at her own edges right now. I've wondered, how do I impart what I've learned as an outsider and someone who's felt like an unbelonger without also coloring or tainting her way into it, because she is not me and she's going to find her own way in.
Yeah.
But I think when you talk about that, you could call it the creative descent. You could call it the initiation. You know, that idea of stepping outside of the circle of safety to find something that resonates with you and you alone. We don't have initiations in our culture. It's been a long, long time since we have. And I think they're hugely important for teenagers especially, but even as adults too. Because a lot of us have not had that experience of being separated from what we know and digging down to find what's truly meaningful for us. And if I could take the leap of tying what I'm saying to your previous work as a podcaster too, what I hear in the conversations you've had with people who preceded me on this show is there are people who have had to have those splits. They've had to find their own way in. They're not just following the path that's laid out for them. And that by its very nature is hard. That's not the easy work.
Yeah,
Initiations aren't supposed to be easy. I've never learned anything of value through ease and comfort, right? So for me, what that means is just over and over again, putting myself in situations that challenge me so I can learn what those edges are and where I need to expand into. And that comes through my creative work. It comes through my professional work as well. I'm a writer professionally as well as creatively. And of course, this is a good hinge into psychedelics as well.
Yeah.
Because for me, they're not everyone's path for sure. For me, that has been a place of challenge and of dispelling the stories that I thought were me that actually weren't working. They weren't serving my life.
Thank you so much. I'm also raising 2 daughters, one that's almost 16 and one that's 14. So I'm thinking about these things all the time, how to let go, because I know I want her to meet that edge. I want her to find that, and I don't want to hold her back from that. When we were talking about your experience in the punk scene, I think that was just shortly after, during you had an influential teacher at was it an all boys school in the DC area, very conservative, and you had a teacher, Mrs. Knipe, I think she was. Is that right?
I think that's how you said her name. I haven't said her name in years, so I don't know.
My dad's a teacher. I love these. You put one adult in the right place at the right time for one kid. That's all it takes.
Yeah.
It's just such magic. But she saw you and she told you, basically took you aside and said, you don't belong here.
Yeah.
You need to get out of here. You need to find some place you can be yourself, and that's not here. And I had a person early in my real estate career who took me aside and said, get out of here. Like, you're meant for something different. And it was really shocking to me that she would risk her status as an insider to speak the truth. And you speak about finding out that this teacher is somehow like a subversive double agent, right?
Yeah,
like, wow.
A sleeper agent, I think I said.
Sleeper agent, yeah. What was that like for you?
It was utterly shocking for a number of reasons. I think by that point, I'm 14 or 15 years old. And I was so alienated from my family, from my community, from this totally oppressive boys' school I was sent to. And I should also point out the shame I felt attending a place like that in Washington, D.C., which was then 70% Black and largely impoverished. Here I am going to this incredibly exclusive, this elite boys' academy. And I don't even want to be there. I don't even want this. I think the sense of being seen was what shocked me the most, because at that point I felt mostly invisible, again, to my family. I didn't really have friends, to my teachers certainly, who saw me as a weirdo and a nuisance. And for one person to step out of line, that was incredibly impactful and an incredible gift to me. What touches me now is that was actually an exchange.
Yeah.
She told me that I didn't belong there, that she saw me, and that I needed to find my own way. But what she also told me was that she was dying, and no one else around us in my class certainly knew that. And I don't know that she had told anyone. And so in this very still moment, I can feel that windowless room right now. I can remember sitting at her desk, that she shared that with me. It made it indelible for me. And I think it was giving her something too, the chance to just express for this 1 minute in this totally corrosive, airless space, that she was terrified, that she was saying goodbye to her life too.
I love that. And saving you in a way, on her way out.
She absolutely saved me.
Yeah.
And I think what's also ironic too is I think I include this in the story at the end of the piece. I mentioned that as I was writing it, one of my classmates from back then randomly reached out. And I thought, oh, I wonder if he remembers this person. And I mentioned her name, and he said, me too. She made me an artist. And this guy has now he's been a painter for years, makes lovely, beautiful, large oil paintings. She did that for him too.
I've heard you speak a little bit about your marriage to the incredible artist, Juliana Bright, who is an accomplished watercolor and charcoal artist, a musician and healer, who explores many of the same themes that you do in her work: success, embodiment, the creative descent. and or heard you speak about how creativity and motivation can come from facing a major problem. In this instance, you were looking at the possibility of the two of you of a failed marriage and it turning into the heat of to either jump off the cliff or take action. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. We had met, we were actually in the same band together, and things developed from there, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of thought we had figured it out. Like we made music together. She was an artist. We thought we were doing great. And we had a kid. And as that will do, that really catapults you into the lights come on and you realize where you really are and how much work you need to do. And it's funny, you use the phrase jump off the cliff. I would say more, in my case, lie in the ground and cover my eyes and ears. That's what it felt like. Mm-hmm. I was in hiding from my own life and from the backstory that I really knew little about. I didn't understand what had brought me here, and my reaction was to hide. And sometimes literally I had a basement studio, and that was my safe place, my place not to connect with the world through music, but actually to hide from it. So yeah, we eventually reached an impasse. She had spiritual curiosity. I had none. I basically wanted to make it all go away. Like, stop bothering me with this. And we decided we needed to separate. There was just, it just felt intractable. And as awful as that felt, especially for our daughter, who was then around 10 or so, I couldn't see another way. We went to a therapist to help facilitate the process of separation. And after a couple sessions, she very innocently asked, "What would you think about trying one under the influence of MDMA?" And I was shocked by that. I had plenty of experience with psychedelics as a teenager, but that was, many years ago. I said, well, I guess we have nothing to lose.
Yeah.
And that's when everything changed. We went into that session preparing to divorce, and we came out understanding that there was so much more work to do, that we had a contract with each other that we had let lapse. We had ignored it, essentially, kind of in the heat of trying to have a household and trying to raise a kid and trying to earn enough and all the things that we do to exist in this 3D world.
I know that you had that experience of psychedelics with your wife. That was a reboot. And then it was also a reboot for you. You talked about you go back to a moment when you were 4 and your dad had returned from the hospital after your mother's death.
Mm-hmm.
And you said you made an unsaid pact with your father that this sadness would be your own, that it would be yours, and that it was long past time to change it. Was this a part of that story with your wife? Was it all, were you able to kind of see all of the connections, or was it a slow unfolding?
It was definitely a process of unfolding, for sure. I think what that first experience did is it just allowed us, even for a few hours, to sort of pop our heads above the clouds and see, oh, this is all story. Like all the things that I've been believing about myself, how I work in the world, what my role is, what my personality is, it's just story. And once I began to drop away, and just the understanding that it could be that you could choose to not listen to your thoughts, that was a real revelation for sure. And yeah, absolutely. My mother's death was, a huge part of that story making that told me my place in the world and how I needed to carry myself. And everything sort of unraveled from there. Absolutely.
I had this experience. I did my junior year in college in Indonesia. And before that, people would probably describe me as very, very funny, but sarcastic and cutting. And it was the way I was defending myself. And I got to that program And the head of my only like American connection at school was a woman that had been there a long time. And she was even better at that than me. More cutting, more sarcastic, more brilliant. And she terrified the shit out of me because I saw in that moment where I was headed. If this is the, the stone I'm honing, if this is the blade I'm honing, that's what it looks like. And I very clearly remember a moment sitting on the edge of my bed where you talk about that cliff. For me, it was a cliff. It was like, I can't go back. Now that I know, now that I've seen it, I cannot go back. I do not want to be that person. And I wound up moving into an ashram. And for many weeks, I spent hours and hours in prayer and cleaning cockroach poop out of the library there and volunteering and making my way and retraining my brain. And now I know many people would be really surprised to hear that I'm just someone that has so many good things to say about others.
Yeah.
I've seen that it's possible. And I'd have a lot of experience with psychedelics as well, where I've been able to kind of selectively bring back forward parts of myself and deal with those that I wanted to rework. But not everyone has the luxury of time of weeks and weeks in an ashram. That was a blessing in a time of my life that I could do that. And so I'm hopeful about the work of psychedelics, like you talk about in treatment or with a partner, or that intentionality to change and start unfolding those pieces and emerging, being able to become someone anew.
Yeah, I mean, to backtrack, it strikes me that teacher in Indonesia was your Miss Knipe.
Yeah.
Right? That was your person, in a very different way, but they showed you, well, this is where you can go if you continue on this path. So what are you going to do differently?
Yeah, I do. Recently had a conversation with a good friend of mine, a writer and a serial founder of all sorts of amazing projects. Her name's Davia Larson. And she was discussing that there was something to be explored in the fact that mushrooms, as psychedelics and as just them themselves, as mycelium, they're healing us by connecting us.
Yeah, that's how they work. They connect trees, they connect diverse species. They're sort of these signalers, from another valence, if you will, from another dimension, if you want to go that way too.
It's incredible. I mean, literally that they are the communication network of trees to communicate with one another and share resources. And as someone who runs a membership organization, we're a group of member of agents in a real estate company, I'm deeply fascinated by this idea that we flourish when connected. And that as someone who's in the work of building communities and helping people find communities, that when we form communities and networks of shared resources, that we thrive. And I see that in my own business, the economy of scale and the overall success of our agents being a direct correlation between the strength of our connections back to each other and that community. I guess to take that further out, I also can see this as like the highest expression of God, or when we surrender to the idea that we are one deep family or spiritual connection, that is available. And you can find that in a lot of different places. Like we find moments of that surrender. You talked about that earlier and seeing Fugazi, like everything goes away. You are not who you are. You're just that you're there.
You're not who you thought you were.
You're not who you thought you were. I've experienced that in sex and love and prayer. And I'm curious what you think about the part psychedelics or that mushrooms have to play for humanity.
Well, fortunately for all of us, I'm going to restrain myself from going into the deep, dreamy. Well, if only everyone would take mushrooms at once, then we had some kind of fractured version of that in the 1960s, of course. And when I grew up in DC, there was what were called street people, who were obviously people who had taken an enormous amount of drugs in the 60s and were now houseless and et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, in response to your question, what could they do? What does this mean? If everyone turned on, I'm forgetting the novelist's name. She's talking about being a college student and her idealism and her dreams. And she said something like, we were going to change the world. We were going to improve everyone's lives. We're going to do such big things. If we couldn't change everyone's lives, we wouldn't change anyone's lives. Meaning, if it's not grand, if it's not impactful, why bother? If it's only a few people, why bother? And I guess what I feel like is I don't dream about everyone experiencing psychedelics or everyone having these emotional, spiritual breakthroughs. Although, of course, I would love that on a personal level. I think for me, what the lesson has been, as someone who did not engage with his community, who felt like he was hiding from his life, for me, the action is on the micro level. What that means is, how do these experiences, first and foremost, change you? As you said a few minutes ago, how do you find access to that compassion and that empathy and that curiosity about others that you were hiding in sarcasm? And I know that one well. Yeah. Humor is always the first line of defense for me. And how do you dissolve into that understanding that you actually do want something deeper from those interactions, from those relationships with your community? So how does that change you, first and foremost? How does that change your family structure? How does that change the way that you interact with your kid or your partner in ways that your parents did not model? How do you change that story? And how do you model evolution to be grandiose about it, but I believe in it? Where does it go from there? Your neighbors, your community, small organizations. I'm involved with something called the Mankind Project, which is, I'm not sure I can put it in a nutshell, but it's basically this notion of trying to entangle the messaging that men specifically get from the society, from their families, about what being a man is, and the damaging messages, of which there are many, many, many that are very specific from the many, many, many that women get in the society. And it's about using kind of Jungian archetypes and shadow work to untangle these things, and then to take it out into the world, then to take that work into prisons, for instance, or to take it into groups that are have not had access to these tools before. My point is, it's little things like that. Yeah. It's the idea of changing 2 lives is certainly not as exciting as changing 10,000, but I'll start with 2.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
And I'll say, as a writer, look, I have an ego. I want people to read my work and, put the check in the box. Yes, good. You did a good writing. Mm-hmm. But behind that, it's my sincere hope that what I share can serve as a beacon to people who feel they have not belonged to their lives. And if I can do that on some micro level, I'll declare victory. I think that's great.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And I hear that you're not, and my intention is not to overemphasize, definitely psychedelics not the only way to get there, right? Mushroom, it's one way. Or nonviolent communication for me has been another way to deeply connect with myself. The first time I saw the list of needs, I sat in my bathtub, I think I was 35, and cried because I didn't even realize I had all those needs.
Yeah.
And I do want to ask, that something I'm thinking about, and I was thinking about this morning during my morning workout, is, my teenage kids will hear this interview most likely. I haven't really talked to them much about psychedelics. They know I'm really enthusiastic about mushrooms, but they don't know that I worked as a psychedelic clown, leading groups, and some of these other things that I've, most people don't know. Now they do.
Now they do.
What is your conversation around your daughter around this? Have you been, you're obviously, she's read about it in your work. How are you feeling about it for her, as she may want to explore some of the edges of these experiences?
Absolutely. I felt pretty intentional about it. For one thing, I knew the messaging I had been subjected to as a young person. And I was also, through laziness or throwing up your handsness, I was exposed to people who I think had really bad boundaries around drugs, for instance. And so that happened early for me. arguably too early, but whatever. It's what happened. My goal for my kid was to allow her to absorb the messages of the culture around her. It's not my job to separate her from that culture. She's her own person, as she likes to remind us, and she can make her own decisions. I wanted her to know what her community was saying about psychedelics. And then when she understood the waters that she swam in, I went on a long walk with her out in nature to a place we didn't usually go. And I explained, this is a big part of our lives, your mom and I. And the ways that our lives have been changing the last few years, the new people in our community, we have a very rich and very close relationship with our neighbors, for instance, who come from that same community, from those intentional medicine communities. The ways that you've experienced us changing and our family opening up and the depth of communication and emotional connection that we have, that comes in large part through these substances that the people around you, at the very least, have questions about, and the very most things should be illegal, should be, grounds for exile, basically. So can you hold those two things together? This truth and that, this truth in the one hand and that one in the other. And from there, it's just been a gradual, I sort of felt her taking that in, and she asked a few questions and just let that sit and percolate.
Yeah.
And that was 3 or 4 years ago now. And that's been opening up. But I will say this, you referenced earlier that event, Judaism, the Psychedelic Renaissance, that I helped organize last year. I presented from my forthcoming book, and I talked very specifically about the family trauma that made my father, my grandparents, and in line me, and what psychedelics have done since to help untangle that. And my daughter insisted on attending. She was sitting there right in front of me, and she insisted she absolutely wanted to hear this story. And I felt her deep, deep love and support. And that was immensely meaningful to me. So she'll come to it in her own way, but this is where the conversation is.
I mean, it's so much how these raising these young people. My heart never feels as tender as when I'm talking about being a mother and loving my children. But it's much in the same way that they'll come into sexuality, that they'll come into a lot of these things where we want them to be ready and we want it to be their choice. And I can see where having these conversations are important, and that just, it's a way of showing them trust too. I'm going to let you see me, and I'm going to let you be a part of these conversations, and then I'm going to trust you're going to make the best decisions for you.
I kind of joke in my family that I was never given any explicit guidance on what it was to be a man, even a person. Like, how do I carry myself? I got no specific guidance from my father. Not to say that he didn't love and care for me, but he was not equipped to drop in on that level and talk about the challenges that you face just navigating this world. What I tell my daughter is, again, I can't give you specifics. You're in a different body, you're a different person. But I will say this, what I've learned through the last years of this work is it is about expanding your tolerance for discomfort, right?
Yeah.
Putting yourself in challenging situations, feeling yourself stretching and feeling how uncomfortable and even painful that can be. And then recognizing at the moment you feel like, I can't do this. You are doing it.
Yeah.
And you're still here.
Yeah.
Okay. So where does that lead you next? How do you find that edge the next time? How do you go deeper into that?
I love that. It's all, because on the flip side of that, there are so many things in this world that we can use to numb ourselves, whether it's work or drinking or all the things. And we numb ourselves because we are so afraid of that discomfort. Like, I was just thinking about how you were saying you go to your studio and work. I mean, it's a lofty aspiration. I'm a musician. I'm making music. But if you're at a point where you're doing it to avoid the discomfort.
And I think part of the issue, of course, is that the larger culture rewards that.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Overachievers are lauded. I mean, that's why you have the Musks and the Bezoses and the this breed of grossly limited men in particular who are leading the society towards what?
You had mentioned earlier you're writing a book right now titled Fatherland that's slated to come out in the fall. Can you share with our listeners what it's about?
Well, first of all, very irritatingly, it's no longer entitled Fatherland. Because a memoir entitled Fatherland was released 2 months ago. I just learned this.
Oh, no.
And you can't copyright a book title, but you cannot use the same title within the same genre. So let's call it Fatherland because I don't yet have another title. So right now, I think that's going to come out probably early next year through a collective publishing project that I'm doing with my wife and two of my writing partners. The book is the story of kind of a lot of the stuff I've discussed with you today. It's coming to this crisis point in my life, understanding that things aren't working and I don't know the way forward. And just when everything is about to fall apart, I'm about to jump off the cliff, as you put it. This beacon arrives to show a different way forward. And that is that experience with the therapist, the first of those experiences with the therapist, and the idea that there's a lot more I can't see. And eventually what I'm led to is that I really have no idea where I come from on a familial, ancestral level. And that maybe that information is having an effect on me in the present day. And the deeper and deeper I dive into this, I recognize, this maybe kind of explains everything. I think for me, the point is that I'm having these intense inwards psychedelic experiences, but what they keep telling me is that your work is not here. Your work is out in the world, right? That's the point of these. Eventually, I go back to Budapest. I go to Hungary to trace down what I can about my family's wartime experience. I won't spoil anything, but I'll just say I learned far, far more than I thought I ever could about their experience there and what impact it had on me in my formative years.
I know your father, after your mother's death, really, he went into work and really just wasn't around. And does this explain to you some of these experiences of like why he might have been doing that just to survive, or what he might have been holding onto or thinking he was protecting you from?
The short answer is yes.
Yeah.
I think what I would say is the way I metabolized that experience. My mother died suddenly of encephalitis, of all things. She was bitten by the wrong mosquito. The way I metabolize this now is that it wasn't so much that she died suddenly. I mean, of course, yes, that was huge. The people who were left were Holocaust survivors, and they had no way of giving me any context for what had happened, for explaining that, yes, your mother is gone. She's not coming back, but we're still here, and you're still okay. They couldn't do that. They were not equipped to. They had not faced the trauma that they experienced back in Hungary. So that was this sort of, earlier I talked about the idea of coming to punk as someone who's been separated from the community, someone who's experienced trauma. That's the beginning of that. That's the start of, this isn't going to work out the way I was told it was. So yeah, all the ways that my father hid in very, very societally acceptable ways. Work harder, be a successful, he was an attorney, travel for work, make more money, do the things, get the, win the awards. But it was all, of course, at the expense of that essential connection.
I was going back to this really, the idea of that music being this place that as kids, the right song can all of a sudden connect us back into ourselves, into our, it's like almost like I want to take your dad and put some headphones on and the right song and like, bring folks that embodiment, like coming back and like feeling.
I don't know that anything could have broken through to my father. And I say this as a man, I miss every day and I revere.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he went through experiences that I struggle to comprehend. What he did as a 15-year-old in the middle of a war, in the middle of being hunted for who he was. And yet, of course, that damage played out. And he, I don't know that a song would have reached him. I don't know that ayahuasca would have reached him.
Yeah. One last kind of question for you that I think is really applicable to all of us who are up to something. And that is, I know that for me, punk rock was the first place as a woman that I was celebrated for my failure. And punk has this through line of celebrating and making art from our weakness.
Yes.
Just I can't play my instrument very well, so I'm punk. It's punk. And so it's also this form of intimacy because we have to be vulnerable. It exposes us. So we must be willing to risk rejection. And I know you've been learning new pathways when facing rejection, which can stop a lot of us from even beginning. Like we just get paralyzed by that. So as an artist, as creator, as lovers, we must be willing to put ourselves out there every day to do anything worth doing, I think. And so how did you lean into rejection with a tell me more attitude?
Mm-hmm.
You talk about, being rejected recently from a editor, and you actually saw yourself leaning in and saying, oh, tell me more, which was a different way of
absolutely
of reacting. And so, how did that happen? How do you bounce back?
I think as someone who for really all of my life felt so separate from the kind of stream of life, I had this sense that everyone else knows how to do this, but I don't. They've all been given some key and I don't know my way in. Mm. And I think what experiences such as those in psychedelics showed me is that there is an essential lawfulness. And that's a wiggly word in a lot of ways. I think of the laws of physics rather than the laws of like ethical laws or the legal code. Mm-hmm. What I mean is things work a certain way. And once you submit to them and you start walking that path, things work because that's the law. For instance, first time I pitched my manuscript and got a rejection note, I felt a weird sense of pleasure and I couldn't figure it out. But what it was instead of standing outside the circle the way I'd done my entire life, I had submitted. Like this is the lawful path. This is how these things work, right? And the fact that I'd put in my best shot, it had been read, it had been received, and then turned down, that felt confirmation to me. Like at least I'm on the path.
Yeah, you're in the game.
I'm in the game now.
Yeah.
And that felt deeply pleasurable, even when it got rejected again and again and again and again. This also goes to the notion of that personal work. I think about the crucible of you finding that person in Indonesia who is a reflection or a projection mm-hmm. of what you didn't want to be, mm-hmm. right? So how do you find that self? One of the ways you find that self is by understanding that those messages that come back from the world are going to hurt. I mean, we have a built-in negativity bias, right? Like we're wired to see things in the worst possible light. How do we sit still enough and know that a rejection isn't a rejection of us? It's just a rejection of us, of our work trying to fit into this one slot, or this result we thought we desired. Well, it's not going to happen this time. So what's next? How do you expand that tolerance for discomfort and step into it further and further? And again, that's a very personal answer. I wish I had some theorem I could share, and maybe next year I will. But mm-hmm. going back to DC Punk, many people have said this, but the very first person who said, I go towards what scares me, was Ian MacKaye. And I never forgot that. And it's the way, I won't speak for him, but it's what I see him modeling, and it's what I aspire to. Right. When you go towards those things and you expand that tolerance for discomfort, that's where stuff actually starts to happen.
That's where you feel most alive, right?
Yeah. How do we expand that? Mm-hmm. I really think that's kind of it.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Seth, for joining me today. I would love it if you can tell our listeners where they can find you and if they want to learn more.
Well, the problem is you have to know how to spell my name. And I can't even do that on bad days. Yeah, I do keep a personal website. It's my name's Seth Lorinczi, SethLorinczi.com. And I share updates about the forthcoming book and do some personal writing on the things you named, psychedelics, the punk scene, music, ...
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for coming in today.
Thank you for asking me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again to Seth Lorinczi. I highly recommend checking out his writing, as well as listening to any of the many bands he's been involved with. We're going to be taking a little summer break the next few weeks, but we'll be back August 31st, where I'll be chatting with my friend and founder, Jill Keeler, about her journey and the building of Freeland Spirits, a woman-owned and operated distillery right here in Portland, Oregon. The conversation, like Freeland Spirits, will be tasty and high proof. See you then. Enjoy, Jenelle.